Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus, and in addition to being a psychologist, I am featured in the documentary about anti-Semitism, Never Again is Now. I am a Dutch Jew and a daughter of Holocaust survivors. In 2006, I immigrated to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller, the founder of the free nonfiction Holocaust theater project, thinedgeofthewedge.com. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest where I was the only Jewish student in all my public school classes. But it was an American community in which our grandparents had come at the turn of the last century. Then in 1970, only 25 years after the end of World War II, my husband, a US Army officer, and I were stationed in Munich, Germany, and that changed our lives forever. Evelyn?
Our guest today is David Hirsh. David is a senior lecturer in sociology at Goldsmiths, University of London, and the author of the book Contemporary Left Antisemitism, first published in 2017. In his book, which is available on Amazon, David aims to develop a sociological understanding of contemporary anti-Semitism. David, welcome to our show.
Thank you very much. Hi.
Did we omit anything of importance in your introduction, or does this describe you for this purpose well enough?
I think so. I don't know. I never like listening to those introductions because you've always sort of sent them over in the first place, and then you hear them back, and they don't sound right. I'm a sociologist. I was drawn into working around anti-Semitism years ago, about 2003, 2004, when the campaign to boycott Israel became a big, powerful thing in my trade union, actually, in the academic trade union in Britain. And at that time, I thought this will be fun. I thought it would be an interesting political campaign. I thought we'll make some arguments and we'll impress everybody with our knowledge and our ability, and we'll win the day. And we really didn't. And so that really drew me into, from a place of having felt very much at home and comfortable in a sociology department and on the left, I more and more felt excluded from it, from both. And I kind of couldn't let that go, really. And it really became my work to understand how that had happened and what had happened and why so many people around me really couldn't see it.
Couldn't
see what, David? Could you further explain to us, please?
Well, the standard way in which Jews get pushed out, actually. So I was a sociologist, and because I stood up against the campaign to boycott Israel, and because I stood up against the anti-Semitism that came with it, I was then kind of transformed from being a sociologist into being a Zionist sociologist. And the term Zionism was not my term. It was not, I wasn't defined as Zionist because that was how I defined myself. The meaning of the term Zionist, in the way that I was defined in a hostile way from outside, was racist. So I'm no longer a sociologist, I'm a racist sociologist. And we're very used to the idea that that racism defines race, right? Race is not a thing that exists naturally in the world or naturally in human beings. Race is something that is fundamentally created by racism. It's complicated, of course, because people do have, very liberational and self-fulfilling identities which are related to all sorts of things like their race. but the way that race is defined for a person who might be walking down a dark street late at night or in a job interview is a different kind of definition. And it's hostile, and it comes from outside, and it imposes categories upon you. And I think that I experienced something similar when I was transformed from being somebody who was actually very proud to sit in a department meeting and look around and think, wow, I'm one of these people, to becoming somebody who was thought of as a racist, a Zionist, a pro-apartheid campaigner, and therefore not really a sociologist at all. And I've seen this happen. Howard Jacobson, the author, talks about it, that he wanted to be an author, and then he became a Jewish author. And Luciana Berger, the politician, she said, all I ever wanted to be was a Labour MP. And look at me now, I'm sitting on the front page of the Times as a Jewish MP. So what happens is that you get redefined. And if you stand up and resist and make some very simple arguments about anti-Semitism, then more and more the standard response is to say, aha, we know what you're up to. And you say, I'm not up to anything. I'm just noticed that, you know, this and that was said, or this and that exclusion looks anti-Semitic, smells of anti-Semitism, creates an anti-Semitic exclusion, borrows anti-Semitic themes. And they say, no, we know what you're up to. You're pretending that you experience anti-Semitism, and you're pretending by mirroring the rhetoric of the oppressed, and you're pretending to be oppressed, but really what you're doing is engaging in a kind of bad faith attempt to delegitimize our criticism of Israel. And that's how it works, that someone who speaks up and who says that they experienced anti-Semitism, they're not just told that they're wrong, or that they made a mistake, or that they are a little bit oversensitive, or that they have a chip on their shoulder, none of that. They're told that they're dishonest, and they're doing it dishonestly with the ulterior motive of silencing criticism of Israel. And that allegation of dishonesty, so when it was in the Labour Party in Britain, the shape of it was, actually, you're really a supporter of Trump, or you're really a supporter of the Tories. And you're pretending to be in the Labour Party, but only in order to lie about what the Labour Party is, in order to weaken it. And it's that discourse which pushes us out, which defines us as alien. And it says, you don't belong here. You're not really on the left, you're really a racist, and you're pretending. And it's that exclusion that creates such a hostile environment, I think.
Let me ask you, let's go back a few years. And you said that you were comfortable. I read a lot of English novels, and I always feel that anti-Semitism is much closer to the surface in England than it is in the United States. So you said you were comfortable in this. Tell us a little bit about your background, where you, if you're willing, where you grew up. Do you have members of your family who survived the Holocaust, or did they come from Poland and Russia, 100 years ago?
I certainly will answer that. I mean, I would try not to speak for half an hour after each question. Yes, my mum was a refugee from Germany, aged 8. She came here in 1938.
Was she by kinder transport?
No, she came with her family. I remember my grandmother very well. She was a lady with a very German accent, and So I was always very well aware of that. My dad came a generation earlier, so he was born in London in the East End, and was brought up in a working class Jewish community, and he won a scholarship to go to a private school, you know, a British public school. It's the
Right.
where I think he had a very hard time. I think, you know, there was this smart, whatever he was, 12, 13-year-old boy who came from the East End and had to fit in this public school where he didn't fit in. I think he had a horrible time. I think he was bullied. I think he learnt how to pass as an English gentleman, which is, of course, what public schools were built for in the first place, going back hundreds of years. And he became a doctor. So that's my mum and dad. So they brought us up they were, you know, fairly successful. In fact, my mum's dad had already been a migrant. He'd already moved from Poland to Germany, where he met my grandmother, and he had a business in Germany. And, you know, I'm very proud. I didn't know him actually, but he died before I was born, but I'm very proud of the memory of him, and particularly that he, I think, was a very acute man, and he realized when it was time to leave, and he basically gave everything up to leave, and he came to England and he started again with his business. And he was again kind of quite successful, I think, for the second time after the second migration. So I'm quite impressed. But then I was brought up as a small child, thinking that I was rather privileged, which is a strange kind of mixture. You know, on the one hand, my parents, you know, my mum was a refugee and my dad was a working class boy, but I kind of felt and feel that I was really made to feel to be somebody with kind of huge privilege and you know, was not, I don't know, was in a sense had everything given to him. And I think my parents were very keen to make everything seem very perfect and very ordinary. They didn't want us to feel like we were children of migrants. They didn't want us to feel like we were one generation away from Germany. They didn't want us to feel any of that. They wanted to bring us up as successful and you know, ordinary English middle-class children. And I think in the end, with hindsight, that was quite difficult, because I think as children, we sort of sniffed that something wasn't quite real. And I think that's partly why I kind of reacted against some of it. I think my sisters reacted against it a little bit. I got involved in left politics. I joined a left-wing Trotskyist group, and I didn't see very much of value in the world that my parents wanted me to be at home in, actually. So politically, I didn't come out of the Jewish community. I came out of the left, which was quite interesting for me, I think, actually, because in a sense, I didn't have any, I don't know, I didn't have, when I started doing work against anti-Semitism, I basically critiqued the left from the left. You know, I was to the left of them, and I had very strong and old and traditions of critique of anti-Semitism. The group that I joined actually was an interesting group. It was quite a small group, but it was quite a smart group. So when I look back on it, in some ways, you know, it was ridiculous. We were trying to bring down, you know, capitalism and parliamentary democracy and all that. So in some senses, it was sort of absurd. But in other senses, I got a very serious political education there. And one of the things that they actually understood was anti-Semitism. which was a minority pursuit on the far left at that time. As I say, later when I came into really a sort of Jewish communal politics of resisting anti-Semitism, I had a kind of quite a different and fresh approach to it. And I wasn't constrained, I didn't feel constrained by what the Jewish organizations thought I should say, or what the Zionist organizations thought I should say, or any of that. I felt that I was able to kind of speak. And another interesting thing happened too, I think, was that, so I remember anti-Semitism in the student movement. I mean, when I was 19, they were trying to ban Jewish societies, you know, Hillels in universities, on the basis that they were Zionist and therefore they were racist and therefore they could not be allowed to be part of the student movement. Like this, even back in the 80s, this was. And so later on, I mean, later on, I found my way out of that left politics. My study of sociology really was a kind of engagement with it and trying to work out why it wasn't right. And that took me a long time, actually. And I went away, I did my PhD, I had kids, various things. And then at a certain time, about 2003 and 4, I kind of felt I was ready for some politics again. And it was interesting. One of the interesting things was that the internet existed at that time and it hadn't existed before. And I had a PhD, I had a kind of education that I didn't have before. And I found myself able to write and to articulate things that needed to be articulated. And it was very exciting. You know, I would have an idea on the tube on the way to work, or I would see something that somebody else had said and I could understand why it was wrong. And I would be able to critique it and it would be in the public domain by lunchtime. And so it was a very, it was exciting, it was fast moving, and it fed my kind of rather kind of addictive need for kind of immediate, there's a word which I've just blocked. Anyway, you know what I mean. And I was having fun. I thought we'll do well here. And then, as I say, my experience was that we didn't do well. We lost. In the end, by 2009, we couldn't have lost more completely in the Union. The Jewish anti-Zionists were, I remember after one conference, were kind of crowing and they were so excited, and they were saying this year, the Zionists didn't even turn up. And what they meant by that was that there were no Jews at all left in the decision-making structures of the Union who were willing or able to oppose the politics of boycott and the politics of anti-Semitism. There were none left. And, you know, you might think that in a union of 120,000 people who work in universities, there might be a few Jews. But
there were no Jews left, or there were no Zionist Jews left.
Well, there were no Jews who they said were Zionist and therefore racist.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? There were certainly some Jews left in the decision-making structure of the Union, but they were Jews who were pro-boycott and who absolutely denied that there was an issue of anti-Semitism, and people who we are all familiar with, I think.
In other words, people were only included in the union. This was an academic teaching union, I understand. If they would be Jewish, they were only included in the decision-making structure if they would turn their backs to the right of Israel to exist, basically. Correct?
Yeah, I mean, it was a little bit more subtle than that, because there was no prohibition, but people were bullied out, right? There was a kind of there was a couple of years when it was very, very hard, and you know, we were subjected to being denounced as being like Nazis and being like defenders of apartheid and imperialism, and we were said to be in violation of the core principles of trade unionism. And you know, none of this was true, none of it, but it was said to us relentlessly again and again that we're only pretending to experience anti-Semitism. in order to silence criticism of Israel, and that the Talmud teaches us that the Jews are the chosen people, and that's why we think we're better than everybody else, and that's why we're racist, all of it. And so what happened? My story was that I was excluded by a kind of bureaucratic process, not from the union itself, but from the online discussions that we were involved in. And the reason I was excluded was because I had published some of the anti-Semitism that was happening within the union. I'd published it outside. And of course, whenever you have a racist culture or an anti-Semitic culture, there has to be quite a strict policing of the boundaries, because inside the culture is different from how it is outside. And so if you take something from inside to the outside, then you are in trouble. And in the end, I was excluded finally because I put a footnote in a scholarly paper which referred to a trope of anti-Semitism that had come up within the union. You know, it was a footnote in a paper that really, you know, nobody reads. So I was still a member of the union. I still am a member of the union, actually, but I was excluded in that way. Other people were just bullied out until they couldn't bear it anymore. Literally, you know, I know people who started drinking and smoking again after 20 years of not having done so. Many people resigned as a kind of, you know, they said, enough, I'm not going to participate in this anti-Semitic culture anymore. I'm resigning and I'm going to denounce the union. So people were bullied out, they were pushed out, or they resigned. And yeah, that's why there were no Jews left in the decision-making structures. Of course, there were still Jews in the union, but basically they kept their mouths shut. And anyway, they didn't stand for election to conference and things like that.
What you describe is an extremely painful process. It must have been so painful, and maybe even more so given the background of your family background, the history of exclusion and discrimination, and fleeing that and wanting to speak up because of that, and then experiencing yourself this harsh anti-Semitic aggressive approach towards you, where you are not the one who defines your identity, they define your identity, where they would not do that for any other ethnic group. So this sounds painful and anti-Semitic, what you experienced at the teachers union.
It was, I mean, it was hard, and it was you know, very unpleasant, and it changed how you felt about the place you worked and about the trade union, and of course remember that there was nobody saw it, right? All the people, to be honest, sociologists, you expect to be able to perceive things that maybe are not said or not said clearly or explicitly, to perceive underlying meanings and cultures and structures of power. You know, sociologists claim to be very good at that. And in general, nothing. So you're right, it was painful, but at the same time, it was not validated, it was not seen. It was
not acknowledged, no.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually this is a kind of universal experience of actually probably all racism, actually, but certainly of anti-Semitism. I remember, you see, on the one hand, it was painful, but I feel in a sense I can't complain too much. I'll tell you why. I remember meeting someone at a conference, was a woman who had been born in Wales, actually, in Britain. And it was in Czech. I met her in Czech at a conference, and she told me that her daddy was a fighter pilot in the RAF. He was Czech, and he had gone to Britain, and he fought the war. I don't know what fighters were doing in Wales, but that's how I remember the story. And her mother had been from the Sudetenland and actually had come to Czech as a refugee, and had kind of hated it and been very angry with the Jewish communities there who hadn't welcomed her properly. And so it was a complicated upbringing. And in 1945, her daddy, the war hero, went straight back to Czechoslovakia to build socialism because he believed in it. And as you might know, within 6 years, Slansky, the leader of the Czechoslovakian Communist Party, was on trial for his life, accused of bourgeois Jewish nationalism and Zionism. And he and 11 of his closest comrades, I think 10 of whom were Jewish, were hanged. And I guess this woman's father was in a kind of second layer of people. He wasn't hanged, he was sent to the uranium mines, and came out 11 years later with lung cancer. So that was her story. So I can see something similar in this man who went to Czech because he was a socialist, and at some point he must have realized that when he had thought that he was at home in building Czech socialism, he found out that he wasn't. Yeah. So I can kind of recognize that. But of course, you know, the shoemakers who ran my trade union didn't have uranium mines, right? They didn't have state power. Incidentally, she also told me that life was very, very difficult when her father was away, because a lot of the other people whose fathers were away, whose men were away, were actually from kind of Christian, anti-communist backgrounds. And they didn't have any family because they were Jewish, and all of their family had been killed. So even amongst the dissident families, they felt very little fellowship, actually. Yeah. And this story repeats again. I mean, I'd love to write the book, honestly. You know, in the feminist movement in the early 80s, in Britain in particular, there was a feminist collective called Spare Rib, and there was a huge anger, of course, with Israel in 1982 over the invasion of Lebanon. And the Jewish women in the Spare Rib collective were driven out. Unless they disavowed, you know, Israel and Zionism and the rest of it. So the same thing happened to them. Yeah. The same thing happened to the layer of intellectuals and intelligentsia that was left in East Germany and in Poland in 1968. There was a campaign against Zionism, and people were given a loyalty test. You know, will you sign off against Zionism or leave?
It's systemic, and it's still going on big time. Yep. In academia. Yep. And elsewhere. David, have you have shared with us in a very clear way what it was to go through this anti-Zionist, anti-Jewish climate as an individual. Have you tried to describe this phenomenon in a professional way, in a socio from the viewpoint of sociology? Like, why is this happening?
Yeah, I have certainly tried.
Could you tell us in a nutshell, if possible, to our, you know, we're lay people, what that boils down to? How do you explain this phenomenon from a sociological point of view?
Well, I'll try. But actually, the thing that sorry, did you hear my stepdaughter has just got an offer at university? Apparently. So okay. There you go. It took me a long time. I wrote. I mean, we were running a campaign. We were running blogs. I was writing articles. And I wanted to bring it together into a book, into a scholarly book. And of course, one of the things that happens when you are in a scholarly community that doesn't recognize you as legitimate is not only is it hard to be recognized as legitimate, but it also makes you not recognize yourself as legitimate. So it undermines your own belief and your own confidence in your own writing. And then it becomes very difficult because you can't, go around saying, well, I haven't been promoted and I haven't been published properly because I'm Jewish and they're anti-Semitic, because people will say, well, look at your CV, you haven't written, peer-reviewed papers. And you'll say, well, actually, the way that peer review works in the big journals is that it makes it basically impossible for people who really take a kind of serious analysis of anti-Semitism to be published. But still always there's this kind of self-undermining too. So it took me a long time, actually. And in the end, I think it all went into into a bit of a kind of dip. And I started really writing again when it started coming out again, when the Labour Party started embracing anti-Semitism in a very serious way, because I knew a lot about it. I'd seen it all before, and I'd seen the same people doing it before. And so actually one of the things that was great was that the Jewish newspapers came to me and said, oh, look, Ken Livingstone has said this, or Moshe Machover has said that, or who is Jeremy Corbyn? And they said to me, come on, write the article to explain what's going on and who these people are. And it was actually a very lovely position to be in, to feel that you had a responsibility for explaining to Jews what was going on. And that was good for me. And so I was writing more, and I got some proper scholarly publications. And in the end, I did manage to bring it together in my book. And I think the book's all right. I think, it's been out for 3 years now, and there's nothing kind of has been demolished in it, and nothing, I didn't get anything terribly wrong. There's a couple of mistakes, but I'm, I still feel that the book kind of speaks for me. So that was a lot of talking, which didn't answer your question. And your question was, please explain to me what this anti-Semitism is and why it's happening. I think, so that's the difficult question. I think that things did calm down significantly after the end of the Cold War and in the 1990s. I think the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians, it took a politics of peace into the mainstream. So a lot of the kind of mainstream left, the sort of majority left at that time in the 90s, was embracing a politics of peace between Israel and Palestine and the peace process, and people had very high hopes in that, I think. I mean, really, people just assumed it was going to happen. And when they, got over the vanity of doing their horse trading, they would make a deal and there'd be a Palestinian state and there would be peace and things would be good. Underneath that, there was, in the West, in Britain for sure, there was a kind of stubborn layer of hard anti-Zionism that never accepted the peace process and never accepted Israel, and always said, Zionism is racism. And this existed in all over the world in different forms. The Soviet Union had been very, very important in making anti-Zionism into an official ideology, right? Not into a kind of ways, things to be critical of Israel about, but by taking anti-Zionism and constructing it into a worldview. Yes. But again, to see that kind of reached its high point in the UN in about the mid-70s, and the UN affirmed that Zionism is a form of racism, but then the Soviet Union collapsed. Then the peace process motored ahead, but eventually, as we know, the peace process finished, it collapsed. And shortly after the final collapse of the peace process, in fact, less than a year after the final collapse of the peace process, there was this World Conference Against Racism in Durban in South Africa, which was supposed to be really a celebration of the defeat of apartheid in South Africa, in a South Africa that was run by a democratic majority. And the world anti-racist movement was coming together to say, where do we go from here? What are the key racist issues that we now need to address the key structures of racism now that we've defeated apartheid. But at Durban, there was a very, very effective and well-organized campaign to position Zionism as that key form of racism that we now had to address following the end of apartheid. So, you know, Zionism, which is not a form of racism and is not globally significant in itself in any sense, was made into the symbolic campaign of the global anti-racist movement.
Could we say that I experienced the same development in the Netherlands, and it clearly had an origin in the Soviet Union, but it became culture. Could we say that after the 60s, it became culture for young people to belong to the people who strive for human rights for everybody, and that was your signature of being a virtuous person, and to fight politically for that, and that somehow the pro-Palestinian activists managed to put their cause at the center of that identity.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think there's lots of interesting and complex things that were happening. So it's really not true that in the 60s, cool people supported human rights. Actually, human rights was kind of thought of as a sort of right-wing American Cold War discourse. And of course, the Soviet Union said human rights is a bourgeois distraction. And what's really important is that the material freedom and benefit to the working class, yes, right? So they said that, and of course, I mean, of course, the smart Marxists were very clear, and I'm pretty sure Marx himself would have been very clear that without human rights, without the right to organize, without the right to speak, the working class cannot liberate itself, right? But of course, the Soviet Union developed a whole different kind of way of thinking and way of talking. So you know, human rights were downplayed as bourgeois and American and right-wing, and what was made the most of first was you know, the workers' state and socialism, and then later, when that began to fall apart, it was largely a kind of dividing the world between the oppressed and the oppressors in a different way, which was through a notion of imperialism and anti-imperialism.
Yeah.
And one of the things that did was to take the democratic states and define them as imperialist, as bad. And it took broadly undemocratic and authoritarian states, and it defined them as the instrument of the oppressed fighting back against imperialism. So just as human rights in the Soviet Union were said to be a bourgeois distraction, so democracy itself was later, and in a sense still is, said to be nothing to do really with the key issue, which is this sort of global struggle between what was called imperialism and anti-imperialism. But that still doesn't quite tell you how Israel becomes fitted into the picture. How does Israel then become symbolic of this global system of imperialism, right? Why is it that Zionism is the symbol for racism? So first you have this dividing the world into good and bad, oppressor and oppressed, in a way that doesn't really reflect who is oppressed and who is not oppressed, right? And then secondly, you have this extra thing of creating Israel as a symbolic evil and the Palestinians as the symbolic victims. And I think one of the things that's, of course, there's nothing new for Jews about being made into a kind of narrative material by which other people define their own identities, right? I mean, you could argue that this is as old as Christianity itself, that Christianity was kind of defined in distinction to Judaism and the Jews. Of course, it's not true that Christianity is in itself anti-Semitic, but there are significant anti-Semitic traditions in Christianity which did define the good, in distinction to the Jews who rejected Christ and who murdered Christ and who reenacted the murder of Christ on the bodies of children and all this stuff. So now we have not the Jews killed Christ, but the Jews are symbolic of and central to this global system of imperialism, which is extraordinary. You know, in 1944, the Jews were suffering the most, you know, one of the most awful genocides in the history of the world. And in the following years, the Jews were driven out of the great cities of the Middle East by states which revolted against colonialism and then defined themselves in ethnic terms as Arab states. And in the Soviet Union, Jews were used in the way that George Orwell shows in his book 1984 as the way to visualize the face of evil. You know, in Orwell does it kind of literally. They have 2 minutes hate every morning and they sit there and they hate the Jewish face of Goldstein. And so we're supposed to believe that between, you know, 1944 and 1948, the Jews shifted from being, I mean, look, at least quite oppressed, I would say, quite oppressed. They shifted from being quite oppressed into being symbolic of global imperialism and racism. It's extraordinary.
After a genocide, yes.
After a genocide, after the experience in the Soviet Union, after the experience in the great cities of the Middle East, it's extraordinary that you know, 7 million people. Well, there's 7 million people now, aren't they, in Israel? Are made into symbols of all that is oppressive and unjust in the world. And everyone looks at this, and if you say, hang on, isn't that odd? Isn't that odd that, you know, 7 million Jews are made into the symbols of imperialism? Isn't that a bit like, you know, defining your identity against and people look at you and they say, well, but you know, criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. And you say, well, sure it isn't, but using the face of Israelis as the face of evil, that kind of is, isn't it? And they look at you blankly. No, don't think so. And actually, we all know Israelis are quite vulgar and quite white and quite rich and quite arrogant. And we know when they finish the army, they go to India and they make fools of themselves. And that's what we know about Israel and Israelis. So the narratives, the ways in which people construct these stories about Jews and Israel and imperialism. And, you know, at the same time, yesterday, it was reported in the press that the Chinese Communist Party has sort of re-established Xi. They're going to give him a third term, and he's been put on a par with Mao, and you know, he and his gang rule over a sixth of the earth. They've strangled any democratic institutions in Hong Kong. They have literally hundreds of thousands, over 1 million Muslims in concentration camps. And yet it's Israel that is considered to be symbolic of evil. And if somebody was here, they would look at me and they'd say, but that's just whataboutery, right? They'd say, but are you trying to deflect criticism of Israel? And I'd say, well, not really. But what I'm saying is that there is, you know, really oppressive regimes on this planet that control 1 billion lives and which do not allow democracy or liberty or freedom or self-organization of the working class or
obviously a double standard. Obviously a double standard.
Yeah, I mean, but you know,
sorry. David, for the sake of time, we have to
Yes, so,
go to.
you know, I think, David, Evelyn and I could talk to you for hours, but really, we want to make sure that the people who listen to us hear all your really important statements. So I think we should just give you now time to do your last thoughts and then end today's podcast. So tell us what you think people should take away from this and how maybe they can speak up against this absurdity that you've been talking about.
And that we see in America now big time as well.
Yes.
Yeah. So now I'm tongue-tied. I've been talking endlessly and now I've got nothing to say. I think that one of the things that's noticeable is that the left does not anymore educate its young people about anti-Semitism and what it means. It's just not done. You know, people have never heard of the protocols. People do not know anything of the history of anti-Semitism on the left, you know, from Bakunin and Bruno Bauer to the socialism of fools to the doctor's plot, to Poland and Germany in 1968, to the Slansky trial. So the left does not educate itself anymore. It has forgotten. And instead it has kind of adopted a different set of stories. And those are stories which position Israel in this kind of particular place. I mean, goodness me, there was a tweet. I mean, it's a tweet, but it's a tweet from an account that I noticed had 350,000 followers, which said, the other day it said that it had an article from The Guardian, a proper newspaper. And The Guardian said that, that with global heating and the use of fertilizers and intensive farming, there's going to be hunger and the farming system is going to be in trouble. And this tweet said, the Zionists all over the world have sold fertilizers to farmers which will decrease their crop and lead to world hunger.
I see those kinds of tweets all the time. It just it boggles my mind. And
it's extraordinary. And I don't even know who this guy was. Like I said, he had 350,000 followers. But there are plenty of professors of sociology and political science and Middle East studies, people who are professors because they have been supported and peer reviewed throughout their careers in publishing and in funding. People who actually have conspiracy fantasies about Zionists and Zionism, which are really not that far away from that kind of stuff. So it's a problem. What are we going to do about it? Honestly, my job really is to lay it all out, to say, this is how it works. This is what happens. This is what is said. This is the history of it. This is why it's not right. This is why it's not true. This is why it's anti-Semitic, right? That's what I do. Yeah. And it's a very important element, because if you are in a hostile environment, if you're in the world of the theaters, I mean, I don't know if you heard this story. There's always a story this week, right? And I've forgotten the stories from every other week, but I know the story from this week. There was a play put on at the Royal Court Theatre, a very cool theatre in the West End of London. And it had a character who was apparently based on Elon Musk.
Who is not Jewish?
Sorry?
Who is not Jewish? I know this story well. I've blogged about this story.
He's not Jewish, right? So somebody in the writing team, in the production said, what name will we give this character? And they said, I know, let's call him Herschel Fink.
Yes.
And then later, I mean, they rehearsed the play, the actors must have seen it, they rehearsed it, the production, everybody saw this, nobody worried about why the rich and powerful and evil billionaire was given this Jewish name. Finally, it came out and they said, oh my gosh, this is terrible. We're terribly sorry. It must have been our own unconscious bias, and we'll pay a penance. And what they did was they carried on with the play, and they changed the name of Herschel Fink to Henry Finn.
Yes, I know. And the worst part is, and then we have to wrap up, is they called it unconscious bias. And I wrote in my blog post, no, this is conscious bias. Nobody who has that many people working on a play, that was not unconscious, that was conscious.
Well, what I said was that Herschel Fink seems to have changed his name in order to appear less Jewish, right? And this again is a well-worn path. Many Jews have changed their names to appear less Jewish. And so the character in this play is now Henry Finn. And often what happens when people change their name to appear less Jewish is that people still remember that you're Jewish, right? So if people still remember that Henry Finn was in fact Herschel Fink, and then they will then remember that this is in fact an anti-Semitic play, then this maneuver won't work well. And I was writing this actually, and I hadn't even noticed when I started writing it that my own grandfather had changed his name from Herschel to Henry when he came to England.
With that interesting historical note, we will say thank you to you, David. This has just been a wonderful conversation. Thank you to our listeners. Those of you who have not yet seen Evelyn's documentary, Never Again Is Now, can see it for free at joinneveragainisnow.com. You can find out more about my free Holocaust play, thinedgeofthewedge.com, which, by the way, I just submitted to the Royal Court Theatre. I'm sure they won't consider it, but since there is a submission process, I did it. Maybe they'll feel guilty enough to put on an historically accurate play. And again, for all of our listeners, whenever you can, without putting yourself in physical harm, speak up against anti-Semitism.